All right, Tanner, do you want to walk us through this?
Sure. So today, system numerics exposes several types: vector 2, 3, 4, matrix 3 by 2, matrix 4 by 4, plane, and quaternion. These types are hardware accelerated, but they only support single precision floating point today. This is ideal for a lot of graphics applications, but it's less ideal in other scenarios like CAD programs where single precision floats might not provide the precision required, and where you may want to be using double instead, or for other scenarios where you may want similar but in alternative precision, such as half, or potentially even integral types, which we've had requests for as well, and which some other math libraries provide support for. So the proposal is essentially, we take the existing types that we have and we expose new variants of them that are generic. This will help ensure we don't have a type explosion as we potentially look to support more types in the future. Today's proposal is only going over supporting having that generic implementation support float in double. But given that it is generic, we would be able to extend it in the future to support other types without needing to explode the number of types we've exposed and without necessarily needing to do more in-depth API review about what we are exposing.
What ends up being the behavior tenor if you use these with unsupported types and fails at runtime?
Correct. The behavior would be the same as vector of t, vector 128, vector 256, and vector 64 of t with unsupported types. It would throw a not supported exception.
Is this something that we could augment using, for instance, the static interfaces proposal later on to support any numeric types?
Potentially, but for some things, it doesn't necessarily make sense for any numeric type, because you may need specialized behavior to do the computation or to handle the intermediates. For simple numeric types like adding, that certainly makes sense, but for other things like the length of a vector, you may need specialized behavior to correctly handle the truncated floating point or fractional part of the result.
And the idea is they're intrinsics anyway, right?
The idea would be that these likewise get hardware acceleration support where possible. For example, with double, you can still use SIMD intrinsics to support them. I don't know if implementing it directly in the JIT is a good idea. I think this might be a good place to use the actual hardware intrinsics instead, so we don't have to explode the JIT with support for additional types here.
Right.
Right. I mean, they would be considered intrinsic in the same way that the non-hardware intrinsic SIMD intrinsics are, which is to say they don't necessarily have direct acceleration, but they'd be recognized and accelerated where possible. And doing that the way Tanner has started to do with the SIMD type, with the existing SIMD types, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I was just trying to understand, even we couldn't make it generic anyway, in the sense that if you want to intrinsify them, then I'm not sure how a generic version would work.
Well, it would be implemented in software for any non-directly supported type.
Right.
Same as Vector 2 already has a software fallback for float, for example, ARM32, where there is no JIT support.
Right, and currently for vector of t, when you try to instantiate it over an unsupported type, it just throws. So there's the types that are directly supported in hardware, and you get, ideal JIT acceleration. There's those that need to have some sort of backup implementation. And then there's those where we say, I'm sorry, you can't use that type. Sadly, we don't have, static interface constraints now, so we can't say, must implement iArithmetic or anything.
Right. I mean, that to me kind of echoes what I was feeling, because I mean, to me, the vector of t software fallback was not exactly super useful to people, right? Because the performance just degraded so much that we probably would have been better off just throwing in this case. And so my concern generally is when you make something more generic, then, unless we really know that we don't regress many things, it seems not necessarily a helpful thing to do. So in that sense, like just enumerating the types might be good enough, right? Saying, yep, you can instantiate this type with X, Y, Z and deal with it.
So you're suggesting that if it was not directly supported by hardware, you wouldn't even emulate it? I mean, I would say this is actually quite different than vector of t. Vector of t had the problem that it was difficult to emulate because it was dynamically typed at runtime. I don't think vector 2, 3, and 4 ever had that same kind of issue. You didn't get a substantial penalty.
That's fair.
Over having done it.
Yeah, if you're convinced that the performance we're getting is good enough, like basically what I'm trying to say is like being generic always has this problem that you need to know effectively like what penalties you introduce, right? And given that we run a wide variety of hardware, I think the idea would be that we are somewhat predictable in how we perform, right? And sometimes it feels like we're maybe giving people too much flexibility at the expense that, they may not be able to reason about how fast their code will actually run. Which for things that are kind of meant to accelerate, that's unfortunate.
Well, that could also, in this case, be trivially handled with a so something that we have on vector of t that we don't have on vector 2, 3, and 4 today is an is hardware accelerated property.
Right.
Which would help annotate, for example, on ARM32, this isn't hardware accelerated, but on ARM64 and x64 and x86 it is.
Right.
So is this intended to be a performance API? Because it looks like it's just kind of a general math API to me, and we want it to be fast, but it doesn't seem like it should be a requirement here.
It's not strictly a requirement for it to be fast, but the scenarios that these types are frequently used in are generally targeting performance. Hence why the original types were hardware accelerated, and why these new ones will be as well, where possible.
Yeah, I think I would be satisfied if our fallback implementation would be just as fast as if the user had implemented it themselves, essentially. Like, they need the operation, and how would they do it if they didn't have hardware acceleration?
I think that's a good bar, because that will be better than vector of t, right? Where if you vectorize your code with vector of t without having hardware support, it will run significantly slower than what a naive version would have been. And I think that's probably the biggest problem with vector of t. I mean, slower is never nice, but if you're slower in a direction where you want it to be 3x faster or 2x faster, now you're like 4x slower, that's pretty bad. So I think I think I would agree with that. And just to clarify, like when I said generic, I didn't mean the T part, I meant the iFormatable part. Sorry, not iFormatable, the iArithmetic or whatever the thing is, where we say like, oh, we support any numeric type, right? That is the thing that I can see being not super fast unless we have support for this natively, right? Versus vector of byte versus vector of int, for example, right?
Yeah, my concern with an iArithmetic version probably wouldn't be performance so much as like, is the API set up now so that we could add that later on if we wanted to, or would it block us from doing that?
I mean, it shouldn't block us, right? I mean, like if we say today you can only, I mean, the question is what behavior do we give you when you use something like a custom struct with vector of 2? Do we allow that, or do we just throw? If we throw similar to vector of t, where we say, yep, you can only pass in the numeric base types, then it's for us relatively easy to open up that constraint to something more generalizable with an arithmetic. That seems fine. I mean, since these are structs, I'm not sure how we could.
I mean, adding an
Create a breaking
interface
change.
constraint is, technically a breaking change, but since it would constrain it to, like, if we already have a runtime check of only 2 types work, then yeah, we could later be introducing a compile error, but only on a thing that was going to fail anyway. So I think we would take it.
I see what you're saying, because basically when somebody writes the generic code, they would have to repeat the interfaces that we have here. And so if we add one more, their code stops compiling now.
Right. Well, if we added a new constraint, and somebody was already passing in some, like they said, new vector of some type that was equatable and formatable. I guess, sorry, the T isn't actually constrained. They said new vector 2 of string. Right. That'll compile and that'll run.
Right.
The thing it'll do is throw out of the constructor. And then if we added the I arithmeticable, then they would now start getting a compile error, but that's fine because the type wasn't going to work anyway.
Yeah, I mean that to me is the least interesting scenario. But it's more interesting to say I have a generic method today that takes a k, and then I instantiate vector of t with that k. If I only happen to use this types that vector of 2 supports for my k, that code will even work today, right? And that's what would be the code we would regress. So we would now say, okay, now your k has to be constrained to our arithmetic. So that would be the actual breaking change.
Yes, that would be a working scenario break.
And that seems unfortunate, but I would agree with you that it seems more beneficial for us to do that if we believe in assuming we believe in arithmetic to begin with, right? If we don't believe arithmetic is super useful, then yeah, we wouldn't do that. But if we believe this is a super useful thing and we can generalize a bunch of stuff with it, then I think we'd probably take that and say, yep, tough luck. I mean, the question is how many people will write generic code over that, right? If we think there's a lot of people doing that, then that would be an unfortunate design direction. But my guess would be if you write generic code without arithmetic, it probably sucks anyway, right? So
yeah, and there's likely a lot more locations in the runtime that would need tweaks to support arithmetic than just this.
Right.
If you want to switch over to the other tab, IMO.
The one with the APIs?
Yeah. This one actually has the T struct constraint as it's supposed to. So the first important detail is something that where this proposal differs from vector of 2. Vector 2 and all the other types currently expose the X, Y, Z, W, and other members as public fields. I am proposing we don't expose them as public fields because that hinders optimizations and other things that we can do to improve the code in the future. For example, plain is currently constructed using 2 fields, where it might have been more beneficial to represent that as a vector 4 internally. And that's something that we can't change with the existing plain type today, whereas having them properties would allow it. The question would then be, do we want the vector, the new types to be fully immutable, in which case you would have just a get property and a wither method, or do we want to have them mutable with a setter? Having them mutable with a setter is likely closer to what people are already familiar with, but it doesn't necessarily represent the optimal way to think about SIMD code in general.
Sorry, the last part I didn't get. What do you mean it's not the most optimal way to think about SIMD?
So with a normal struct, you are working with scalar-like data. So when you mutate a single value, you're actually going to be mutating it in place, generally on the stack or somewhere else.
Right.
With a SIMD type, these actually represent a single register on the CPU most of the time. And so when you mutate it, it behaves much like other primitive types in that it mutates the entire value at once. So if you set x, what you get back isn't you just wrote x to memory. It's you modified a physical register, a sub part of a physical register, and got the entire register back as the result. And so a wither is more close to how you should actually think about SIMD, but it's not necessarily as optimal for the software fallback or for people who have already been using the existing vector types.
I see.
The withers are how we did the new vector 128, 256, and vector 64 types.
So these would be implemented with SIMD, but you wouldn't have like a vector of vector 2s and doing a dot product on all of them, right?
Correct. You would have a vector 2 of float or double, or potentially in the future one of the other primitive types like int.
So is the proposal then we only support float and double for now and blow up for everything else?
Right. The proposal is we support float since that's already what's supported on the non-generic version. And then we extend that to support double because that's a scenario that people have been frequently requesting. And then because it's generic, it opens the opportunity for us to support other types in the future as people either request them or as they become apparent that we should provide them. Some people have asked, for example, int and uint, which would be frequent for use with certain windowing applications, for example,
Right.
where they don't use float and double. But there isn't a clear ask for that today. And it would also significantly bloat the amount of work that would be required to implement this.
So between vector 2 float and vector 2 today, like, is there any difference then in performance or behavior?
No, they would perform exactly the same, except for some scenarios where, because the fields are publicly exposed, users could, for example, take the address of a field, which could hinder code gen, or do other things to the fields that aren't necessarily a SIMD-friendly way to interact with it.
But basically, if I have vector 2 code today, I could move to vector float, modulo this address taking, and now I could make my code generic for float and double if I wanted to.
Correct. Outside of breaking API changes.
Which we don't propose, right? I mean, you basically copied vector 2 and made that the same, except
Well,
for field being properties, right?
There's at least one other place where there's a suggested break, which is around length, which is a method today, but which likely should have been a property. And then, of course, there's some parameter name fixes that went in, where they are just value 1 or like value 1 and value 2 today instead of left and right.
Right. Yeah, that would be good if you could call that out, because it seems like the scenario that you want to support is people being able to move from vector 2 to vector 2 float, right, or vector 2 double,
Right.
with minimal work. I mean, it's clearly an API breaking change if they expose their vector 2s today, but logically at least that's what we would like to enable. Cool. Then how do you want to do this? Because we probably only want to spend 1 hour on this, or do we just want to walk over the differences then?
Yeah, I think that would be fine. And I've commented all the differences here. So the first difference is we actually expose a copy2 method that takes an array today. And for vector of t, we exposed span equivalents, and we have constructors that take it. So the first change is expose constructors that take the array and take the span, since they don't exist today, but they likely should.
And then, so what's the behavior for the vector array one? If you have more than 2 elements, we just take the first 2?
Correct. And we throw if there's less than 2.
Yeah. That would make sense. I think that's the same behavior for vector of t, right? Yeah, any concerns with that? Doesn't seem like it.
Is it that it doesn't exist on vector 2 at all, or it's just not a constructor?
It doesn't exist at all. We have the copy to method, but not the create from equivalent.
Okay.
I mean, one question that we should ask ourselves is like modulo the breaking changes in the sense where you move the field to a property. Should we add them to vector 2 so that if you could also move from vector 2 float to vector 2, or do we believe that's a non-scenario going the other direction?
I think the same scenario exists on vector 2. I guess the bigger question is, do we want to, for APIs that are added to vector 2 moving forward, do we also want to mirror them on the older vector 2 type?
That's kind of where I'm heading, because the question really is like, how do we think about these types moving forward? Do we think of vector 2 being obsoleted by vector 2 float, or do we think they are synonyms and we should keep them consistent? I mean, it's certainly less typing, right? I mean, that's what be the benefit.
They're functionally equivalents for the most part, and part of the proposal is having a conversion between the two of them. So I think it would be fine to mirror, as long as we're okay with that. Otherwise, I would suggest only adding them to the generic versions moving forward.
I think it's easier to explain if you would mirror them. Would be my guess.
Through this edit, or for all edits going forward?
Moving forward. I mean, we could say, okay, vector float or vector 2 float is the replacement. So if we do that, then we would effectively deprecate the old ones, and then maybe even have a code fixer that replaces usages, right? And then just say, yeah, sorry, you took an address of a field, too bad, you can't do that with the new thing. But if they effectively behave the same, then why would you do that? And I don't think this is a type where we will have a lot of trouble with, like, oh my god, we add 4 more methods and now we have to add 4 more methods over there. That seems within the realm of acceptable, right?
Fair enough.
The next difference here is we have negate, but we don't have the inverse of negate, which is plus, which is essentially the identity operation. I put it here just because it seems like we should have it for parity, and it's the only place where the compiler actually doesn't require you to have the inverse for parity.
I mean, why bother having it?
There's some people who like to align the code, and having an explicit plus allows you to do that without actually modifying the data. I don't think that it's strictly required, but it felt like something that was missing, given it is the direct inverse of negate.
Well,
I mean, it's a no-op.
because plus isn't abs. Plus is no-op.
Right.
Right. It's identity, which is the inverse of negate, which is return the opposite of.
Well, I'd say negate is the inverse of negate.
No, but I think I get Tanner's point, right? If you write math code, sometimes it's nice if you can just put them in the same spot, and you have 2 lines to each other, and it makes sense, right? I mean, I would hope that our code gen is smart enough to not make that expensive. I would hope that we just make this a no-op.
Maybe. I mean, yeah. Theoretically, the JIT should see that it just says return this, and it completely elides the method invocation. But as a custom operator, the compiler can't. It doesn't know what that operator is going to do.
Right, but I mean, the implementation will be trivial, right? As you said, like normal inlining should ideally already take care of that. I mean, if only the JIT folks would be on the call to comment on this. Yeah, to me it seems fine. I mean, I don't know. Do we have any guidelines around operator identity? Do we say don't do it? Do we say have it, or what? If you
I
have
don't.
the negated
I
one.
don't remember seeing it at all. I'm searching through the PDF. We talk about operator minus only in that we should name the argument value.
Right.
I
And
guess that
when I
could
was
be one.
when I was looking through the docs, all I saw was the consider exposing the friendly operators, and the name of it is plus.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I would not object.
We
to
support it for
to
the other types, so it makes sense somewhat to support it for this type, like int and float. It works. So
Well, in int and float, it's language intrinsic, not a custom operator.
yeah, I guess the question comes down to would we be leading people down a suboptimal path by supporting this?
The implementation could be completely elided, just like we do full elision for some other methods.
Yeah, I mean, like, we should ask the JIT folks, but my personal take is, like, unless somebody can prove to me that this makes code worse, I think I'm fine with that. I mean, it makes sense from an editing standpoint when you align code. It makes sense from a consistency argument. We can do it on the primitive types, but I wouldn't be able to do it on the vector T type. I mean, unless there's a perf penalty for that, it seems fine to me. You slightly bloat IL, but like that, I don't think you can measure that really.
If you want to scroll down IMO, the rest of these are the exact same as on the existing vector 2 type that's on the screen now. There's a comment here on transform vector 2 position by a quaternion rotation. Most other math libraries name this rotate rather than transform, specifically when it's being done by a quaternion. I'm fine with keeping the existing name, though, for compatibility.
I believe that's the name that came from the winner T types.
Actually, I think it might be from X and A.
Oh yes, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, X and A for
My memory's
whatever
fuzzy.
X and A for whatever reason decided to go with a name different from what the DirectX math library used, and what, for example, GLM and most other libraries operating on vector 2 types do.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm fine either way. I mean, like, it's not like one of those APIs where I mean, if you never used a quaternion, I don't think it necessarily occurs to you that that's a rotation either. So
I don't think we should be correcting names. We're just taking this one or the type and making it support multiple backing numeric types. So we should match names wherever we have them already.
Yeah, I agree with that.
That's fair. And when I write the next proposal for .NET 6 to extend this with various methods that are missing, we can maybe discuss this again and decide whether a alternative name is applicable.
Right.
And then the only other two remaining bits on this is copy 2 that takes an array and that takes an array plus index already exists on vector 2. There is none for copy 2 span, so that was added. And then for length and length squared in particular, vector 2 have them as methods today. However, their implementation on hardware, on all hardware that exists within the past 12 years is approximately 4 instructions, sometimes as few as 1 instruction. And so realistically, this should have been a property, not a method.
So what's the benefit of making a property again?
you don't have to use parentheses every time you access length, which is one of the most accessed members of vector 2 and vector 3, 4.
Why the heck did we make it a method?
The most accessed member on vector 2 is return 2.
No, this is the vector length, the Euclidean length of a vector, not
I see.
not the number of elements within the vector.
Right. That makes sense. I mean, it doesn't, but it does.
Oh, yeah, then that
makes sense, yeah.
I think it's better as a method. You're mathing, you're not returning a field.
Yeah, the other
Sure.
operators all work on as methods. Makes sense.
Right, but this isn't really a method. It's a property of a vector from the mathematical sense. In the same way that the determinant, in the same way that the determinant of a matrix is a property of that matrix.
Right, but are you doing more work than returning a field?
No. In fact, in a lot of cases, this will be less expensive than reading memory. The implementation is effectively the dot product of the vector with itself, which takes between 1 and 3 cycles and takes 1 instruction on modern CPUs. For length in particular, it's that, followed by a square root, which is 2 instructions.
I mean, my argument would be...
And takes 1 additional cycle.
So my problem with that is, so we cannot have a property and a method with the same name, correct?
Correct.
So that would mean if you would make it a property, you have this permanent breaking change between vector 2 and vector 2t, right? So now every time you move between them, you have to add or remove parentheses. Is that better or worse?
It depends on how frequently you would be moving between them, I would think.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I'm just asking because you're more of a domain expert here. But if we believe that we want to align the types so it's easier to move between them, then that seems like almost like similar to the naming thing, like an arbitrary change, right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus the field one, we just say, well, we really fucked up the design of the type. We shouldn't have made them fields in the first place, and for performance reasons, it's better if they are properties. But this one seems more like a synthetic, aesthetic difference, which now makes it just annoying to move between the two.
That's fair.
So, I mean, we probably shouldn't have made it a property in the first place, but this goes back to, if you want to, do you just want to extend the types, or do you want to fix the types? Because if you fix the types, then you're probably better off obsoleting the other one. Otherwise, it's going to be a nightmare.
That's fair.
Yeah, so there was a question in the chat that I've been looking into. So back up in the operators section, you have a scalar times vector, but you don't have a vector times scalar. Is that just a typo in the proposal, or did you actually drop it out? It looks like the non-generic does have both ways.
There's both here as well. It's the first group is multiply and divide, which is vector and vector. The second group is vector by scalar. And the third group is scalar by vector only for multiply.
I see. There's no... Okay, so... Right. Okay.
Question on the static methods. It looks like we're going to be asking people to type vector2 of t dot clamp. Can we just add these as overloads on the non-generic vector2 class struct?
That's actually a really good idea.
Yeah.
Are they going to be in the same library?
Yeah, they'll both be in core lib and then system numerics as the ref assembly.
Yeah, that does sound like a good using the generic inference with a non-generic, or with a non-generic type that uses the same as the generic type without the generic argument.
That's also how we've done the split for some of the other types. Like vector of t, we've got vector of t and just vector. where many of the static methods are just on vector. Although in that case, just vector is a static class rather than an instance class.
Right. Yeah, I think having the slight weirdness of all the statics live on the existing type is probably better.
It also reinforces our belief that we shouldn't obsolete the type, because that would make it really awkward.
We could obsolete its constructor.
Yeah, but that's a weird message. It's like, oh, the type is bad, but the static methods are good. Seems a bit of a cognitive dissonance.
Just means we repurposed it.
Okay, so all the static methods will essentially move to vector of 2, except for the operators.
Right. They'll move to generic methods on the non-generic type.
Or we could also make them exploded methods, which would free up the possibility of not supporting one of the methods on a future generic type.
That's fair. It also reduces the number of places that you can
explode
get
the
that generics. Well, by using exploded instead of generic on the other class, the other type, it means that we've already snipped out the only 2 types work, not all T's.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that you couldn't have gotten one because the constructors would have already failed, but it does. It'll even remove the. Well, no, it wouldn't, because that would only be the constructor. Never mind.
It removes everything except for you're doing default of vector of unsupported T, basically.
Yeah. Oh, that. Do we care that will break if anyone wrote the word default? I think default, we usually say you get what you get if you wrote it.
Yeah, you should really use .0 for that case.
I mean, the other question I have is if you explode the generics, it now means you can't write the generic algorithm that can be instantiated over float or double. Do we really think that's good?
We've said that was fine for the intrinsic types in particular. I'm not sure if we want to say that the same applies here, since this is a more general purpose API.
It also seems it's kind of the opposite direction of what we would like to go with arithmetic, right? The point of arithmetic would be that you can write generic code, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you explode it now, you're completely screwed because you can't do anything with this type. I mean, you can invoke methods on it, but anything involving math, you would be blocked. So I'm inclined to say, unless there's gains we get because we can implement them differently or omit things, I would just keep them generic.
Yeah, I think the only benefit would be if there's hypothetically some API that you don't want to support on some future type, on some future supported T, it would allow us to make that more clear. But for the given set of APIs, I don't think there's one that fits that bill.
I mean, we could also just make those cases analyzers and say, sorry, this operation will throw at runtime,
Yeah.
Don't do that.
Okay, so moving forward, vector 3 is exactly the same as vector 2, but with a third Z property, and with a new static cross method, since the cross product applies to vector of 3.
I was taking notes. Like, what did you just say?
Oh, I was saying, moving forward, the vector 3 type is exactly the same as vector of 2,
Oh yeah,
but with a new z property
right.
to represent the third element, and a new static cross method, which since you can perform cross product on a 3-dimensional vector. All the other APIs are the same with the same notes and comments.
Makes sense.
It does have less transform methods, since matrix 3x2 doesn't work with a vector of 3. It only works with a vector of 2. And of course, all of these mirror the members on vector of 3 proper.
So, given that you're proposing the instead of fields having the properties and you propose them with get only, why are you doing individual read only methods instead of making the struct a read only struct?
That was to explicitly call out the difference, because as I stated at the start, we could either have it with setters or with withers. The withers weren't explicitly listed here, and naturally, if we do get only rather than with a set, and we have the withers, then it would be a read only struct instead. It was basically if we decide the property should be mutable, then the struct would be mutable, and therefore these have to be explicitly read-only. But if we decide that the withers are actually better, then the struct would be read-only instead.
Do you have a sense of how much people modify vectors as opposed to just create and math them and read them?
Modifying a vector isn't necessarily abnormal. The thing that is abnormal is potentially modifying a vector as if you're not returning the entire vector. For example, there's explicit instructions for inserting a particular element of a SIMD vector, but that returns the entire vector as the result. It returns a copy with the one value modified, so it is functionally a wither.
But yeah, because right now, because vector 2 is a mutable struct with all the dangers that come from that, of the ease of modifying your local copy when you meant to be modifying a universal copy, and I think it's probably, while it is a deviation, if we don't think that most algorithms working with the vectors are replacing element values, then I think I would advocate making the struct a read-only struct and adding the with methods if that's valuable. Because you can certainly do it of just pass the components into the constructor.
Yeah. If there's no questions on vector of 3, vector of 4 is again the same, but with one additional field and no cross product method. Methods being the same as on the non-generic vector 4.
So, but to just go to Jason's question, is there any mutation happening right now?
No. So even with the non-generic vector of 4, every method is actually read-only, and the only reason the struct's not read-only is because the fields are directly exposed.
And the fields are not itself marked as read-only, I suppose.
Right, they can't be.
But it means the one that are properties now, because you don't have a setter, you could actually make the struct read-only, right?
Right. And if you were to convert, the downside is if you're converting between the generic and non-generic version, then you have to translate setting the field to using a wither versus just setting the property. But like I was saying, setting the property isn't necessarily the correct way to be doing that when thinking about this in terms of SIMD code.
Right, I guess, because right now you expose all properties as getters only, right? So the question is, assuming that's the design, then is there any reason why we wouldn't mark the struct as read-only? Because you didn't mark them as read-only. So is it just an oversight, or?
No, like I was trying to explain, it was I put this as get only because that was the desired design, but I explicitly marked the individual methods as read only to show that. It was like I mixed two concepts when I was doing the actual writing the proposal here.
Makes sense. So then, are there any objections then to making it read only? I suppose not, right?
I mean, for devil's advocate, the objection to making it read only is you do lose a little bit of the ease of translation. But I think that there's justification for making them properties, and once we're making them properties, we should make the whole struct read only and either add the with methods if we think that they're valuable, or people can explode it into the constructor, which would give them, if they needed to modify two things, that's presumably going to give them better performance than calling a with twice.
It depends. In particular, the with methods are easier to optimize for the case where you're modifying a single value, which is more likely to be the common case. For the case where you're modifying more than one value, the constructor would have to do some analysis to determine what the optimal way to insert those additional elements were. It might be two separate inserts, it could be a shuffle, etc. We don't currently do any type of analysis like that today.
Yeah, I mean, I assume that the constructor wouldn't look at what's already in the register. It's just splatting. Right. So, but if you're doing two writes, it's possibly better to just do three writes instead of figure out two writes plus another thing.
Is it a breaking change to make a struct from read only to read write?
It is a very, very, very complicated and confusing runtime breaking change because the compiler, until you recompile, the compiler is not making defensive copies. So anything that would then have a side effect write becomes visible through read-only code. Because read-only is an instruction to the compiler, not to the runtime.
I see. So the answer is yes.
A great way of blowing people's minds is make it read-only in the ref and not in the implementation, and then mutate it.
Yeah. So basically, that means we cannot decide later that we make the properties set. So that means we need to make up our mind now, or basically not mark. I guess if we don't mark the struct as read-only, we can
changing from non-read-only to read-only. Like adding the keyword later is not visibly breaking, but removing it is.
So that means if we can't make up our minds whether we want to make the properties set, then we just leave the types as they're currently proposed, and then either later add the read-only keyword to the struct or add the set to the property.
Yeah, if we don't think that we can make a decision, but I don't think that I've heard anybody really supporting making the struct mutable, so...
Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor of making the struct read only and move on.
Yeah.
Me too.
Okay, then let's do that.
And I assume this will apply to all of the types, including the ones once we pass the word vector?
Correct.
Tanner? Okay.
Yep. So again, vector the same, or vector 4 the same. And then we've got plain as the next one. There is one notable change here. The field on the normal plane is called D. I named it distance.
Yeah, I've got no opinions on whether it's good or bad from a point of view that I don't know enough about the type, but it would be in the same vicinity as you're fixing up names, and it seems.
Well, but this is in the section you have comment marked as fields, which are really properties. Are you saying that
the actual field is named literally the letter D, but everywhere else, such as parameter names, we use the word distance.
Right. So if when you change from plane to plane of float, you have to change p.d to p.distance.
Right, which I think is immensely more clear. And I think D was just a bad name. It violates most of our naming guidelines, etc.
Yeah, I guess my question is like same thing. If we expect people, if we don't deprecate plane and we basically say plane and plane float are effectively indistinguishable, then I would probably not do that. I would just live with the fact that we fucked up the name in V1. I mean, it's not great, but like it seems less problematic.
At the same time, given the change for fields to properties, that people may already have to make a change there. This one in particular, I would think would be something that would be reasonable for them to fix.
And using the data we have on APIs of .NET, it looks like only 1 out of 3 users of plane access D.
Yeah,
and if it is particularly problematic, we could expose an alias property named just D.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For reasons I can't articulate, I'm in favor of the rename.
I like how we are very consistent here.
Well, like the one of transform versus rotate, like that one feels like it's harder to, like it's a little harder to figure out why the method that you were looking for doesn't exist as you do the move. We at some point we made a decision on the name, and I think we're sticking with it in the type hierarchy. But the unless planes have a concept called D, which I don't think they do, then the name should have been distance already. And the fact that if you go to D and IntelliSense pops up, it says, "Did you mean distance?" is like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I think that the cost or the confusion is going to be much lower on D becomes distance than on transform becomes rotate.
I mean, I buy the IntelliSense scenario, right? If D doesn't compile and you invoke IntelliSense, you're basically merely standing on distance, but which would be different from transform to rotate, especially because transform would remain. It would just be one overload is missing.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, people feel strongly about it. I'm not objecting it. It just seems a bit weird that we make disjoint decisions here.
Yeah, and that's why I said, like, I know I'm having trouble articulating why it feels different to me.
Yeah, and I don't have a super strong opinion. I just feel that, unlike some of the others, this one is particularly bad in how it's exposed as just D.
Yeah, I won't go so far as to say that I'm strongly suggesting that we do the rename. I'm just saying that I support it. And because I think it's less complicated than the transform to rotate rename.
Yeah, let me just say I don't feel strong enough to push back. So then let's just do the distance thing, and then move on.
Yeah. The only other thing for plane and the following types is unlike the vector types, they don't implement iformatable. I don't think that's something we necessarily want to add here, as I'm not quite sure what it means to format a plane outside of allowing custom formatting for the individual components of the plane. We'd essentially just forward it down to the underlying T. But I don't feel particularly strongly about it. I just wanted to call it out.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say if we add it, we should add it to the other plane type as well. But yeah, other than that,
Yeah.
I don't have opinions.
If the current plane hasn't needed iFormatable support, I don't know that we would add it at this point.
Sounds good. Quaternions next, and it's there's no special gotchas here. Same, mainly the same comments that have existed elsewhere. There was a couple the only other comment about name was there's create from axis angle. Most other libraries use create from rotation axis. Given our existing comments, that one no longer applies.
Right, especially because as the static, this will just become a generic overload to the existing create from axis angle.
Right.
So.
And then after that, there's matrix 3x2. Assuming no one has any comments on quaternion. The most notable thing about this type is, given how many fields it takes, it realistically should have a constructor that takes a span, especially considering it's essentially just a vector 3 of vector 2s. We don't have that today on either type, or even a copy to method, so I left that off. It may be something that I will put up a proposal for in the future.
Yeah, it seems like you almost want to have the same constructors you have on vector, right? Where you have an array one, an array with an offset, and a span one.
So unless we want to make that decision here,
No, I mean, I would just record this as a suggestion, but I think it makes sense to me.
okay. And then the last type is matrix 4x4, which is the same yet again, just with essentially being a vector 4 of vector 4s.
Yeah, this one definitely wants an array.
Yep. Well, and one of the other things that this likely should have had, but which we couldn't do with the original matrix 4x4, is there should likely be an X, Y, Z, and W property that returns them as a vector of 4. So X would contain M1 through M4, M11 through M14. Y would be M21 through M24. As that's frequently how you actually want to interop with the types, or interact with the types mathematically.
Did you expose in here? No, you did not. You just...
No, I did not. I just, as with most of the other APIs here, outside of the span constructors, this is just a direct port of what we already had, so we could get through it in an hour, and for simplicity.
Yep.
Yeah, I wouldn't do feature additions now.
No, I just want to make sure that we record it so it doesn't get dropped on the floor, because it makes sense. I mean, given that you move to properties, yeah, you basically open up the door to do that.
I assume that identity property is wrong. It's just a copy paste error. Quatern.
Yeah, that's a copy paste error.
Okay. I think I saw that on matrix 3.2 as well. It should be of the same type as the class, right?
Correct.
And these are the multiplicative identities?
This is an identity matrix, right? So
yeah, that's the identity matrix, which is the diagonal of 1.
Right.
Of all.
Well, because it's not the additive identity, it's only a multiplicative identity, because
Right.
matrix. But if identity is the thing that we called it on the existing type, then that's the right name here.
And that's also the mathematical term for it.
Fair enough.
There is Jeremy trying to show off math knowledge.
Well, in group theory, you talk about the additive identity and the multiplicative identity, and you have to qualify which one they are, because in integers, one of them is 0 and the other one is 1.
I thought they're called elements, but fair enough.
Is
And then that-
identity, is that, I'm assuming that doesn't take very long to compute? And it's not,
Right. It's I believe it's just a cached value today. It might actually be created dynamically. Let me check.
but either way, it's probably not that long to,
Right. It's essentially just returning a today it's a cached field, but it's just returning a matrix with essentially 4 vector inputs.
I think the question is on the Boolean is identity property, not the
yeah,
static
that's what I was,
Oh,
identity
yeah.
property.
No, yeah, that's basically just an equality check against identity.
Which is property fast.
I mean, it's
Yeah,
01.
it's for comparisons.
well, on 4x4, it would be 16.
No,
No,
it's
I'd-
4 because SIMD.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
on modern processors, it's 4.
right.
Everything except for ARM32, or if the user explicitly disables SIMD.
Or WASM.
I thought WASM had some support for SIMD, but we might not support that today.
I think it's fine being a property.
Yeah, I mean,
Yep.
Yeah. For the matrix types, the one thing I didn't call out was decompose and invert the static methods here. They return a bool, so they're functionally try methods. We didn't name them try, but I guess given the compatibility, we don't want to change that. And since they'll end up on the non-generic class or non-generic struct.
yeah. Yeah.
But then that's all of the types here.
Cool. Then I think that's all, right?
Yep.
Let me just copy paste everything I just have, which is a lot, apparently.
Yep. And then I've got some community members that are interested in helping implement this, so that's great.
So in other words, you can slack off again.
I'm extending my reach of impact.
Yeah, that's what you write in your connect, but we all know that's code for slacking off. All right, so let me just copy paste this guy in. Which is basically everything you had write-up-wise plus the comments. Which is beautiful to scroll. And then I think we can call this a day. All right, logging. Do we have the right people on the call for that?
I believe
Yes.
Ah, there they are. Who wants to give the overview? Miriam or Fowler?
I guess I'll go ahead with the overview. So if you scroll down to the bottom of the issue description all the way, there's the original proposal that John Speed had for having the structured log viewer. Just a little bit further up. Yeah, right there. So basically, the way at the moment we have logging set up is that there's 2 options on the console. Either you would have multiple lines per log message, or a single line, which is, I believe, for like containers, if I'm not mistaken. So for containers and such, there needs to be like a 1-line log message, but seems like now there's more interest to have better customizability for logging, and therefore there were 2 requests coming up. Is that one, to also enable having JSON format logs printed, not only, let's say, if we right now have multiple lines or a single line or colored or whatnot, and additionally, basically making it more customizable. And if you scroll up a little bit, I have like a screenshot of, yeah, right in the middle, of like the first one is what we currently have. If it's multiple lines, it's the default. And the next three of them, like the one that says default when it's not multi-line, the next, this one could be kind of one of the two requests, satisfying one of the two requests, which is still have be one-liner, but more readable.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go back, there was systemd, that's already the third one. This is already existing log. And there is a slight difference too between the last two you just saw. Each log message could have different colors inside of it. You see, like for example, for argx, these are like kind of, I don't know how to, maybe I think they're variables, are they, David? That could be, you could have it within a message that you can, if you wanted to color them. So basically, and it all stems from other logging libraries like Surilog that already do that, but our like Microsoft Extensions login doesn't. Now the last of the four screenshots is what it could look like in a JSON format. Like for the last of the four like blobs is like an exception where it would have like stack trace message and whatnot, and then at the end it would have something called scopes. And but this is a little overview of like the four different types of log messages that could be there. But if you scroll all the way up, I tried to summarize everything. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. So there's four items up there, A, B, C, D. As I just tried to point out, to have a readable and colored compact format, which will log which we can log just using a single line, and then also to add a JSON-based log format. These two don't exist yet. And C, add an extension point so that users can specify their own custom log format. So let's say they may want to have JSON, but not necessarily those with the way it's formatted and built in. So to have that customizability as well. And 4, be able to control the formatter, like let's say if you want to have like timestamp or whatnot via the configuration. So the proposal I have adds APIs in order to satisfy all of these 4 requirements. And the usage is a little bit, if you scroll down a little bit below, it would show how the usage would look like. So the first one is like for point A, adding a readable and control compact formatter. That's how you would do it. And then for adding the built-in JSON, that's the second code blob that would do it, and so forth. And David, if I missed anything, if you wanted to add.
That was good. There are fluent APIs. I'm so sorry. I mean, I'm not sorry, but I'm sorry.
Sorry?
No. I mean for Ewan and Jeremy.
Okay.
I'm looking at the code samples.
Yeah.
To my eye, it looks like we're duplicating. Like first we're adding console, and then we're adding another logger. But that's not what's happening.
No, that's the or. Like the first one is you can do builder.addConsole. That would give you the default behavior. Or you could do builder.addConsole, and then you pass the name.
Oh, I would do one of those two, not both.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So one pattern thing that we kind of do is we normally do this thing around sub builders. So normally you can do add console, and add console would return a console builder that you could do console specific things off of. But since that thing already returns the top level builder, we can't do it here because it's a breaking change. So instead, we have to have a different top level API to configure console specific sub options, which is a little bit unfortunate, but to avoid the breaking change, it's kind of required. Does that make sense? So normally this would be like add console, and then you get like an iConsole logger builder, and then off of that you do add JSON console formatter, add blah, because you're configuring the options for a specific provider. So it kind of gives you a nesting where you say like, I'm going to configure first the login builder, which is top level, and then you say add console, which brings you into the console namespace or console specific options, and then you would configure things for the console. In this model, we're just adding it top level because we can't. We don't want to break the API, the return value of add console to be something else than login builder.
So when you say you break the API, because I mean, add console doesn't exist, right? You're adding this API right now, but you're saying
does.
that. Oh, it does?
No. So add console has been there the whole time.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm looking at this the wrong thing then because I can't find it. But probably it's an extension method, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I
Right.
can't find it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, I see now. Okay. That makes sense.
Just in case you wanted to view all of the APIs that would be like added or modified in one tab, if you scroll down all the way, I have like all the way, even more. There's a link to implementation, and then there is the ref file that shows all of the changes there.
So this one here?
Yeah. Just in case you wanted to view it there.
I mean, it certainly helps to just look at the API surface.
Yeah. So the add console, there are existing ones, but then those like 5-6 lines, those would help configure which of the log formatters built-in ones you want. Or line 15 and 16 is add console log formatter. You can provide your custom formatter with the option, so the T formatter and T option. T formatter would implement iConsole log formatter, which you'll see below. It's a new interface, and T options would implement iConsole log formatter options, another interface.
So are lines 17 through 19 just shorthand fast paths for doing something that someone could do anyway with lines 14 and 15?
If they want to configure the options, they would need to use those last 3 lines. But if they, unless they can use the app settings files and use configuration, because I'm not exposing the implementation, I'm just exposing the options, the formatter options.
Do you have to call the first line? Do you have to call add console formatter name of JSON and then afterwards call add JSON console?
No, if you don't want, if you don't want to customize the options, you just use add console. You pass the name. But if you want to fully customize, let's say for add JSON, for JSON you would use add JSON console log formatter, and then within it you're configuring all the options for JSON.
Just to be crystal clear, the last 3 lines, the add default, add JSON, add systemd, those exist purely because we haven't exposed the concrete logging types for default JSON and systemd. Because if we had exposed those, then you would just call add console log formatter new JSON log formatter, right?
No, you wouldn't, because that thing takes arguments that are passed in via DI. So here's the crux, right, of the issue with why we add overloads instead of exposing the type. The type has a bunch of arguments that come from the ambient environment, right? Are passed in from being. You don't own the construction of those types, so you're saying what type you want, and then someone else will create it on your behalf. That's the gist of it.
But isn't there, maybe I misunderstanding, isn't there some API that allows you to get a configured type T based on the configuration file?
Above add console log formatter and add console log formatter, the 2 ones above it, I think it's line 13 and 14, but since as T formatter, JSON console log formatter, and the other 2 are not exposed, then we wouldn't be using those 2.
Sorry, I'm not making myself clear. Is there an existing API that lets me say, get me a default log formatter instance configured based on the configuration file?
Not really. I mean, so you'd never do that because you aren't consuming it yourself. It's being consumed by someone else, and you're configuring it.
I see.
So you call add console. The console provider itself is the thing that instantiates the formatter, and you tell it which one to create.
It's just an interesting inconsistency between the built-in ones and a custom one.
Oh, the custom one. So the add console log formatter APIs are a convenience for doing what like add JSON console does, right? If you want to add your own formatter, you call this overload, and we will add the right goop, and you give us the type, and we will do the same things that the default ones do, the JSON, systemd, and default, to wire it up to make it work well.
And maybe I'm kind of like similar to Stephen. So if I were to write an add immo console log formatter, what would these things do to actually wire up?
They would add the right things to DI so that the console logger can resolve it. And it would give you a way to specify options, for example. So you would write immo's log console formatter. It would implement that interface, and then you would take in an immo options, and the T options maps to that options, and then the user would call add. You would implement an extension method called add immo log formatter, and you would call in that method. You would call add console log formatter, immo log formatter with immo options. And we would add the appropriate like services to the container to make it be understood by the console formatter.
Again,
does that mean that you expect? Sorry, Mary. Just a quick question. Does that mean that you expect the add console log formatter methods to be like infrastructure used by someone creating their own logging type versus the add default, add JSON, add systemd methods are more meant for user consumption?
That's right. Yep.
And those last three call the two above them.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, that makes sense.
So just one sec, sorry. Do you? Okay, so I actually, he reminded me that I obviously have examples there. So if you wanted to see, if you go back to the other tab, scroll all the way back up because I have this like how you use the usage under usage. You can, So there's these four. If you want to add an extension point so that user can specify their own custom log formatter, this is what they would do. Builder.add console, they provide their own name, and then they do add console log formatter, and then within it, they're specifying the options for that custom console log formatter options. And also, if you wanted to see how, again, in the PR, I have implementations as well. So if you wanted to see how like those different APIs looked, but it's basically how David described. This is just convenience for setup.
Do you need to call both of those methods? In both of those cases, you call add console with the format.
I
add console
think
format.
at the extension point, there's no other way because, actually, I think I may be wrong. I think no. I think I need both because there's no other way to provide the name for the formatter. So you see, it says add console custom JSON.
No, so we could support that. We could support it, but when you call add blah, it would set the right console arguments to make it pick the right formatter. It just means that then the order matters. So if you add 10 of these, so there's a pattern where you could say calling add is how you turn it on and how you select the right one, or calling add is how you say you want to put it in this put data in the system to say what this thing is, but then something else has to pick the actual specific one being used, right? So for example, what could happen is you can imagine having a plugin that ran on Azure that added an Azure specific formatter, right, to the system, but then the user could pick which one it wanted based on the environment variables. So adding isn't necessarily a way to say it to select it. Those two are decoupled today.
Yep. there's other ways to set the name of the formatter, I think that would lead to the next bullet point, which says we would need to be able to control the formatter used as well as the formatters by configuration. So in the absence, if you scroll down a little bit. But
a question on what David said. David, I just want to parrot back what you said and see if I got it right. So the add console that takes a string just sort of makes that name available in the system or registers with the system. I might want to use that. And then the add console log formatter actually turns it on?
Vice versa. So add console passing the string will select that name for usage. But then calling add JSON console will just add that to the system. All right. So calling add JSON will put that in the system, but then calling add console passing a name in selects the JSON formatter. Does that make sense?
Maybe I'm confused again. In these two examples,
yep.
There are these two add calls.
Yep.
Both of those are needed?
Yeah, so the first one picks the formatter, and the second one adds it to the system.
I think there's another use case here worth mentioning, which is you can choose the formatter via configuration, but add multiple formatters like via code.
I guess what I'm struggling is what I'm adding in both of these cases, and I have no idea what I'm adding to.
So I think that overload is misleading a little bit. It might be. So add console passing a string in might be a bit misleading. The other overload is you call add console and you get a lambda, and you say options dot current formatter equals JSON, right? And that's more of a selection. So add console just says add the console logger. The string custom JSON is picking a specific formatter for the console logger. Maybe that overload should, I don't know.
I added that overload. So the one that you just takes a string didn't exist. If you go back to the other tab, you'll see what did exist in the overloads.
Yeah.
I'm still confused at add console that takes the string picks that one to be used.
Yeah, so I think that overload is maybe confusing.
Yeah.
Add console.
I wouldn't do that multiple times, right? I wouldn't say add console JSON, add console default, add console systemd.
Correct, you wouldn't. Yeah. So maybe we should remove it.
Maybe it shouldn't be add. Maybe it should be
add versus use.
No. See, the problem is add console is doing a different thing, and that happens to be a shortcut for like add console and also select the current formatter. So let's just get rid of the overload because it is confusing, because add console actually means add the console provider. And there's like different providers, right? So add console needs to exist as a thing. And then the other option, the other behavior being added is, and also as a shortcut, select the formatter for this console provider, right?
So does that mean
couldn't me just calling add JSON console log formatter imply that I need a console? Like, when would I ever just call add console and not do anything?
If you want to configure options for the console logger without configuring the JSON specific options. So there's a hierarchy, right? There's console has options, every formatter has their own options, and you can configure both individually. So I think one thing we could do is if you add a formatter without calling add console, we could make it add console on your behalf. That actually would be a good change, because it would save you having to call add console for the common use case. The problem is you still need someone to select which one you want to use. So if you called add JSON and some other component in the system called add Azure specific logger, then the last one wins. Like which one wins? I mean, last could win, right? But that would have to be figured out.
For sure, configuration should be able to pick it no matter what, right?
Yeah, exactly. So config can pick it. No, yeah.
But if nobody picked it in the config, then what do you do? Is the question.
Right. Yeah.
Last one win seems decent. Either last one or first one, I guess. In that case.
Today, I think we do last wins for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what is the recommendation here?
So I think couple of things. Remove the overload that takes the string is one of them because it's confusing. If you add the formatter, well, when you call add, what's it called? Add console log formatter, it should add the console logger as well.
Okay.
That way, for the most part, you call add blah, and it will add the formatter, and it will set the default to be that specific formatter. So last wings.
Okay.
And then if you want to configure console things, then you can do it by calling add console and passing in a lambda.
All right. The issue is if we scroll all the way down to the deprecated APIs, one of the things that we're deprecating is the console logger options.
I don't think the whole thing, everything.
No.
Oh, okay.
On it, but then.
Sorry, where is that? Where do I have to scroll to see that?
It's after the API is listed. Yeah, it's after the API is listed. Here. So in the past we had this console logger format default system because we would just pick between those two options, and now we're going with more and also using custom. And so instead of we're using this to actually pick it by name, pick the formatter by name. Also, because each formatter would have its own formatter options, then it didn't make sense to keep these these properties that you see on console logger options anymore. So then therefore, instead of deprecating these and instead adding an interface called iConsole log formatter options. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's 4 properties, and then the 5th one is the format. The 5th one is the format, which is of type console logger format. So these are the only ones that would get deprecated, basically, because we're gonna use other things to set up the options. It was just informational.
And it's a bit unclear to me what the replacement is. Like,
if you scroll up, there is this interface called. These guys are the replacement. These 3. So default console log formatter options that implements. Well, you have to see the interface first. If you scroll up a little bit more.
I think to answer your question on what replaces it, we need to establish the hierarchy. Initially, we only had console logger options, and now we have options associated with each of the formatters. And like previously, there were just 2 formats, and that was an enum. So stuff has been replaced by moving them from the console logger to the individual formatters.
So basically, each individual formatter basically is a console logger still. So they have all the console options, and then they have their own options on top of that. Like a JSON option would, have some JSON specific stuff, like how to quote and stuff. And so the idea would be these options here are deprecated in favor of the configure message, the configure methods that basically give you the lambda, right?
These are being deprecated in favor of the formatter options because you would have 1 per formatter, so like the a custom one can have its own.
I think the only mischaracterization with your statement, Nemo, is like the configure lambda is just one of the ways of setting the options.
I see. Because it's this option thing that you guys have, right? So there's multiple ways you can configure options. Okay, fair enough.
And one more thing to add is that you see console logger options was the one that was used by the add console overload to set up to pick formatters, and now it has an extra formatter name property that we use to select which of the log formatters we want. And that's the only usage for it from now on. Just to select the log formatters.
Okay, I mean, I have a hard time following the mechanics, but like, I think I have a high-level understanding of what's going on here. So maybe we should look at the APIs, because it's the way I think is more about the APIs and the usages. And it kind of seems like if these are the only changes you made. No, there's more.
There's
right?
Scroll down.
Oh,
There
here we
is.
go.
We talked about most of them except for iConsole message builder.
Yeah, so that's the main one I think to talk about once we get past the other stuff.
Yeah.
So I think
So-
I think I understand the setup here. Like we said, we removed the one that takes a string. I still don't know what the replacement for that one is.
It's just more code, but you won't need it for the most part, because I think we said if you call add blah formatter, it will call add console on your behalf, so it will configure the console logger with that formatter by default without having to call two things.
So literally just remove the add console string overload and then have the other ones do whatever magic they have to do.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think there would be need for adding another API. It would just be removing that because it's confusing, and then actually those last four would internally make sure the proper value is selected. There's one thing though. I have a question for you, David. iConsole log formatter has this getter, which is the name. No, actually, you're right. This is possible, so never mind.
Yeah.
Right, so then I think that one makes sense. Then I think Eric was about to ask a question when I interrupted him.
Well, I guess I have two. Sorry. One is, if we get rid of that overload, do we still need console log formatter names? Those const strings, or like where would we use those strings if we got rid of that?
The second overload of add console has a lambda that takes the console log options, and that still has formatter name on it.
Line 13.
Line 13. Yeah. And the option is on line 40. Well, not line. Is that line 43? Line 43, formatter name. So you can still manually set those.
Ah, okay. Okay, then the second question I had was about the options. We have both a class and an interface. Or
do we?
I think the interface was a constraint to use in the generic overload of add log format, add console log formatter options.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can force options to have that base interface.
But you can do it with the base class as well, right?
Jesus. Yeah. I mean, we should. It's fine. Or we use default. No, we shouldn't. It's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, it could be a base class.
Okay. So basically, these are the deprecations, except for line 43, which is a new like the formatter name. If you scroll more. Then.
Should we look at the custom formatter API now?
Sorry?
Should we look at the custom formatter now?
You mean the custom message builder?
Yeah, sorry.
Yes. I think Emo is writing notes.
Yeah, I was just typing. Turns out scrolling and typing at the same time is hard.
It would easier if I took control and then scrolled down and up, or it doesn't matter. No?
Yeah. So which one should I look at?
Okay. So we talked about default formatter options. It has. I think the most important one is line 77. Basically, I think the rest are just properties added.
Well, we should look at the we should look at the iConsole log formatter as well, because that actually, I think it follows the whole trend.
So basically, each time you do write like a log message, you do log write message or anything, internally, the console logger would be calling this line 75. It will first pick which formatter it needs to use, and then the formatter will call line 75, and it takes the log level. These are all pretty much everything that's already been passed on, except for I don't know how much detail I need to go into for this.
Scroll
So
docs.
basically-
Good question about the behavior about reset color and set color. So what happens if somebody sets the color twice and then called reset color?
Wait, don't jump ahead. Let's talk about the formatter first. Yeah, before jumping to colors. Good question.
Yeah, so basically, I don't know how to summarize. Do you want to summarize, David?
Yeah, sure. So the logger internally has a background thread that actually logs to the console. So when you call log, it stores stuff into a queue, a string into a queue basically, and then on a background thread does console write line for performance reasons. So we have to take the current message being logged and turn it into a string. So the job of the formatter is to turn that object into a string. So it gets passed all the same arguments that log gets passed. So this signature matches what log takes, the log level, the log name. What's log name? Is that category?
Category, yeah. This
Okay,
is category.
should be category.
Yeah.
Category, event ID, state. Scroll across to the right. Exception.
And then there must be the formatter.
The formatter to turn to and then the formatter is to actually stringify the message. So T state is the thing being logged, and the formatter is basically to string. And then I external scope provider is a thing we should discuss, and then the builder is what you write to actually create the message. So then log gets called. We call format, passing in the right state, turn it into a string. The string gets put into the queue, and the queue then writes sometime in the future. So all this is doing is trying to serialize the message before for writing at some future point. Make sense?
I would say yes, but let's say, so what I actually struggle with is like, maybe I don't understand the abstractions you have, but like you said the formatter's job is to turn effectively the T state into a string, but how does that compose? I mean, that makes sense where you have like JSON and text, but like how does that compose with colorization? Like that seems like not a formatter issue then, right? That's an outputter kind of concern, right?
Yeah, so here's the design issue that we basically had here. Like the writing, so we need to somehow expose something to write colors. And we don't have a great abstraction for that. So the question is, do we expose an abstraction? Before it was all internal in the logger itself, and the console kind of did its own thing. But if we want it to be pluggable, you need some way to express that you want to format the message with these colors in this way, in a way that I can serialize and pass somewhere else to log, right? So I have to kind of like say, I want to write this part in red and this part in blue and this part in whatever, and then send that across to something else to write later on. So it's kind of some micro IL format for like console messages. And the builder is the current state. It isn't the final state. It's more like, this is what we came up with. Do you have anything else that you could think of? We had an idea to do an array of string and color, right? Yeah.
I mean, naively, like what I would think is very close is basically the normal ANSI escapes, how VT100 works, right? Like that would be. I mean, it's not. It has problems too, but I mean, it's basically at the end of the day, you're still talking about a string that happens to have magic strings in them.
I am 110% behind that. All strings. How do you guys feel about strings with ANSI codes?
I mean, if we had an API,
what do we do on Windows? Do we like look at that string and then turn it into actual calls to each color?
There's two things. One is the new Windows terminal actually will support VT100 natively, so you don't have to do anything there. If you still write with legacy, then yes, that would have to happen. But I mean, I would say if we would provide, let's say, a VT100 writer and a VT100 parser, then I think it would be fine to say color is just part of the string, and then if you ever care to extract it, then you can, because you have a parser.
Right.
And then
I prefer that.
because that would also make it a bit more orthogonal, right? We don't have to, because if you now want to do something with SQL, you know, we have to reinvent that shit again, right?
Yeah, and I also prefer it from a perf point of view because you can turn it into a string once, and then on the other side, once it's dequeued from the queue to log it, you can split it and keep it all on the stack without having to like worry about splitting things across the formatter and the thing doing the actual write call.
Right.
Is there anyone else that can consume this string to do something with it?
The console logger is the other side of this. It is a consumer of the string, so it would have to understand that format.
What if somebody was just listening to standard out? What would they get in that case? Do they get the ANSI colors?
So the contract between what the string does and what the console and what gets to the console is what we decide the console logger should do in the face of seeing that string. So it's kind of internal. And the console logger can either dump it as is or it can format it itself.
So like as a data point right now, we had like disable colors on the console formatter, which I believe we turned on when it was redirected. So if someone's just consuming stdout, they will get all the control characters now.
Yeah. So we should keep disable colors on the top level options then, because that still seems to be relevant.
Especially if we're going to strip them.
Yeah, and there's no point making a breaking change for that thing. It's hard coded in a ton of tools actually.
So what we have now as an interim solution, is it fine or no? We need to.
No, so the builder gets turned into a string. So it does make the implementation potentially more complex. But it simplifies the interface. I think format would return a string.
Okay.
We would get rid of the builder.
Okay.
And that would be.
Wouldn't you want an API to be able to, again, build up these messages? Like,
but yes,
today we expect you to know, whoever's writing one of these custom formatters, if you want strings, you need to go look up the color code and do it yourself.
It can be shared internal code for now.
Honestly, I would say like I would be in favor of saying we have a VT100 builder, right? That just allows you to I don't think we should ask people to go look up ANSI escapes, but like I think it makes more sense to have a generic API that is kind of like a string builder to do that is not tied to the logging framework.
Exactly, yeah. So it's orthogonal to this. I admit this supports strings and then do that as a separate review.
Like in system console?
Yep.
Yeah, wherever we want to put it, but I mean that seems, because I mean I've done VT100 by hand as well, and it sucks, right? it's not pretty.
We do it multiple times everywhere.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, we have code for it in ASP.NET Core too. And
it's always going to be not pretty, right? And it's also surprisingly error prone.
So does that mean format, David, you're changing to be returning a string instead of being void?
Yeah.
Okay, because I was going to give the comment that either it should be called write because it's a side effect method, or it should be non-side effecting and returning something. But if you're making it be non-side effecting, we solve that problem.
Yep.
And then the whole iConsole message builder goes away. Obviously, it's not passed into format anymore.
Yep. And the scope provider.
I mean, you need that.
You need it. You have to have it. I'm wondering if it needs to be part of the interface here, or if it should be part of the implementation can get access to it if it needs to.
How would it get access to it?
Dependency injection, all the things.
But how does it get the scope for the current thing you're logging?
So the thing that creates the formatter would understand to pass in that type, or we put the scope provider in the container, so it gets resolved when you resolve your formatter.
Wouldn't that be potentially breaking because like Serilog, like other libraries replace the scope provider, right?
Breaking where? No, they don't replace it. They just don't use it.
Okay.
Can we give like the 10-second what scope is again real quick, just to try to know what it is?
Yeah, so scope is basically an ambient set of key value pairs. It's an async local that stores key value pairs, so you can add ambient context to every log. So you can say like begin scope, the current request ID is 5, and every log will have that stamped onto the log. So it's a way to correlate context in an ambient way across multiple logs. And the scope provider gives you an API. I mean, think of it as passing you an enumerable of name value pairs that you can append to the string.
So if we go through DI and these, I'm assuming these formatters are probably like singletons.
Yes, they are.
We get just one provider, but then that provider knows I'm on this current thread, so this is the current scope for this current thread.
Yep. Yeah, I think we should consider it. My concern is that the scope provider was not in the first version. It was added in like 2.2 or 2.1. So I worry about putting it in the actual call to format because like log doesn't have it. It gets passed to the logger via the same mechanism. So I'm concerned that like we will add more stuff maybe in the future, and it shouldn't be part of the call to format. And Emo's gonna say this should be a base class too.
Most likely. I mean, my other question is, how much do you care about perf? Like, do you really want the formatter to produce a string, or do you want the formatter to just write to something else?
So here's the issue with that. This has to be serialized because it needs to be sent to a different thread. And that does seem implementation detailish, but it's super important.
It's super important so you don't get your logs to cross-write on each other, right?
That and performance. The console is like a global log. I mean, want to push you off the request thread before doing a write.
So by serialization, you don't mean putting things into a byte array. You mean like ordering the calls.
Well, no, both.
So then I don't understand, like, why do you have to serialize across thread boundaries? Because you're still in the same process. You can just pass data by pointers, right? You don't have to.
You have to serialize it into a string, is basically what he's saying.
Yeah. So when you call a log, we have to turn your context, your state. So T state is an object, right? And that has to be stringified in place because the contract is that once the call to log returns, the person can keep that object and do stuff with it. So that could be reused, for example. So you don't want to hold on to it and pass it around. Yeah,
so basically what you're saying is like the entire log message needs to be one continuous thing, because if you have a writer, then multiple threads basically would emit parts of it, and then the whole log would be unreadable. I guess that makes sense. I mean, it just means that if you have a ginormous JSON payload, right, like it's not going to be super cheap.
Yep. Yeah, that part does suck. So if it wasn't a string, I'm not sure what it would be. It would have to be.
Well, it could be something that is kind of like a buffer kind of thing that, you know, tries to be better about not allocating things and shuttling things around.
What's that? Oh, what's it?
Can be stream.
A stream?
Yeah.
No. So a stream, it's a bit weird because isn't streaming? It's more like a list of buffers. I mean, it could be a read-only sequence, but I'm not sure.
I mean, you could, for example, say it's a string builder, right? Because the string builder is already better than the string, right? Like, because you don't force the whole thing to be contiguous in memory. You can rent buffers. They can be disjoint, and then once you're done, you just send the whole string builder over, right? And that's still probably better than individual strings.
Yeah.
The idea behind the iConsole message builder was kind of that as well. Behind the scene is just doing the append as a string builder does, but then in between the lines, if there's like color changes, then you would have done like append message 1, message 2 within the log. I mean parts of the log, and then reset color because you want a little bit of it to be a different color, and then you set color and then you do append again. So it's basically behind the scenes for a single log message is using a string builder. But then now you're talking about returning either a string or a string builder or something. So it's just going to be along the lines of what's already happening behind the scenes, what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
I guess fair. Like, I mean, yeah, I'm just asking because it seems like if you codify effectively in the API that the thing must produce a string, then optimizing this away is harder, right? Like, if you say it's a side effect thing, then it's your infrastructure, and how that's wired up is kind of an implementation detail for the user, right?
That's true.
I mean, it could be like a text writer you get past a text writer, and then you just write, and then you're done.
Yeah, text writer is using string builder as end, I believe.
Well, we could use text writer
actually as well, right?
Yeah. That's not bad. So it could be a text writer that we could use to pass to you, and then the implementation could be smart.
Right. We can cache them, right? We could reuse them.
Yep.
Reuse the buffers.
Yep.
Yeah.
I mean, that was kind of the thinking behind the message builder, was that we could cache the message builders and then reuse their buffers when we're done with them.
Yeah.
Right.
So maybe it makes sense to make it a text writer.
I mean, that's the other thing, right? Like, I'm thinking, like, how would we do these, VT100 things? And we would probably make them extension methods over either string builder or a text writer, right? Because then you can use them with whatever thing you have, right? So long you can write to it.
I like that.
And then
so potentially it's a write instead of a format, and then it would take in a text writer.
I just, one thing about the iConsole message builder not directly exposing on a text writer is that we can still do that as an implementation detail, but on Windows, where we don't want to format a string and then reparse out like the color codes, we have that ability, right?
No. So the difference is, do we want to have the color APIs? That's the main thing, right?
Yeah, because if you remove the color APIs from iConsole message builder, what's there is basically just append, right?
Text writer. Yeah. So color is what makes this special.
Log is error is another thing.
Yeah, that one's interesting.
Um.
STD emphasis studio. Yeah.
I mean, is that really a formatter's decision? I think I talked about with this.
Yeah.
It's like the log level is supposed to say whether it should go to the standard error or not.
Right.
Yeah, that isn't really an option. That isn't really a formatter decision, right? It's more of the console logger itself decides where it goes based on level.
Okay, so that could be included.
So that one goes away, and then if you get rid of color, then you really only have append and clear. Build should go away, I think, as well.
Yeah,
even
build. Yep.
But the reason I kept build is because you could still be appending messages. It's just going to do something similar to string append, but then build is what's going to kind of wrap around. If it's for ANSI colors, it's going to wrap around this and encode the strings, or like if it's for Windows, I don't know, actually enqueue to the. Add to the queue, or
it shouldn't. So the logger should call format. It should pass in whatever context needs to be passed into for that synchronous call, and then after it returns, it would have all the state required to enqueue it and send it somewhere else. So the only thing we have to figure out is if we want to somehow encapsulate color in this interface being passed to format/write.
I mean, I'm still
I think we said that's a separate thing, though, right?
Yeah.
Like half an hour ago, I thought we said the color part, we should separate that as a separate API.
Oh, perfect. So then format turns into write, and it takes a text writer instead or instead of returning a string, it takes text writer, and that can be optimized. That sounds pretty good, actually.
So what does clear do on the message builder? Is it supposed to clear the console?
no. I'm trying to think.
Sorry, they're asking hard questions.
No, it's basic because when I was just writing this, the implementation looks pretty much like a string builder, which also has reset color and set color in it. So the clear, and then the console message builder would have have constructor injected the queue, the processor, and it would, whenever build is called, it would kind of add to the queued for the processing of the.
I see. So build is basically take everything I've given you, make it a single message effectively, and post it into the queue to be written out.
Either that or set color. If we wanted to do parts of it, like each colored segment would be one blob, that could also work.
I
so
see.
Set color build. And then clear would. It's just like the string builder clear. What the string builder, that's the implementation detail. So maybe that shouldn't be exposed. But.
Yeah, because then I think what David said makes sense to me. Because if you then just say this is just a text writer, and we have some other way to construct colors, then that seems reasonable. I'm not entirely sure like what the constraints are on the writing it out part, but if you can assume that your console supports VT100, you can literally just print it out as is.
I don't know what VT100 is, but I just looked at the implementation differences between Windows and the other like Linux and whatever. So on the Windows side, you have to write one at a time for each color. You can't just but it's just the implementation detail is a little different between Windows and not. But I'll accept it because I don't have a background much in it.
I just think assuming VT100 is extremely wishful, right? Like most of our customers are on Windows using even the default like VS dialog is not a VT100 console.
Does it matter? It's about the contract between the formatter and the console logger. So it's up to us if we want to parse it or not.
Yeah, and I mean, even on Windows, I think, it's supported in CMD as well. You just have to set the setting at the process level.
Okay.
I don't think it's it's not a shopper on Windows either. You just have to opt in, and I think you have to be on effectively some version of Windows 10 that has it. So it wouldn't be supported on Win 7, let's say, but you could say on Win 7 you just parse it and then do the console.set color codes before you write it out. Which again wouldn't help you perf, but that would be probably not.
If you say disable colors.
Yeah, you could disable the colors.
If disable colors is set to true, we expect the formatter not to write the ANSI color codes into them, or do we expect us to strip any ANSI color?
For disable?
Yeah, if disabled colors is set to true.
Yep. Strip.
Yeah.
So it's on the formatter options, right? So the formatter can just honor the contract.
It shouldn't be on format options, though. It should be some. Wait, you mean disable colors?
Yeah, right now it's on each of the individual formatter options, right?
Maybe it shouldn't be. I don't know.
That's the nice thing when you make it part of the string, right? Because it's no longer a side effect, right? It's literally part of the payload, and then you could parse it out, right?
Yeah. Yep.
If you literally have a worker thread whose whole job it is to just write to the console, it probably also isn't even that bad performance-wise.
All right. So are we saying that? So are we agreed on text writer, or do we want to have a thing that describes color in the contract?
That kind of depends on how we want to do VT100 in general, but I would think for now I would just say, assume there's a separate BCL API for that. And maybe you want to design it as part of this and then just say it's a separate issue, but you design it and then see whether that works for you. Yeah. But it seems like, as Eric said, we already do it in 3 or 4 places already, and we should probably have an API for that anyway.
The super nice thing is console.out is a text writer, right? So it's like if you wanted to have an API where you could start writing colors to the console, hanging it off of text writer, like extension methods on text writer, sort of kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's why it feels sort of kind of fine that an iConsole log formatter takes in a text writer. Yep. You might think that it's console.out, but it's not. Yep. But at least it's like the same contract that you'd get with console.out.
That's true. That's a good point, actually.
So that's kind of why I like it, I guess. Text writer.
Yep, that's good. It's a good change.
Okay.
So we are over time now. Like, should we just let you go for now, and then you just come back with like a rethink of this?
Sure.
That would be great, I think.
Thank you. Thank you for the time.
Can we define what we agreed on and what we didn't agree on? We need to come back with,
I agreed on everything.
because this would it would be good to avoid rediscussing everything.
So, yeah, I don't feel like I'm in the best position to do this, but like I can just summarize what I've written in my notes, and then because my notes are also somewhat hand wavy because I'm not sure I understand the concept 100%. But we basically said we want to remove the add console overload that takes the string and rely on the other ones to do the right thing. We said instead of using iConsole logger options, we should just use the base type console logger options. We said instead of tying colors to the formatter, we should decouple this by exposing a generic VT100 builder for colors, maybe even a parser. This way we can simplify the architecture here by making iConsole formatters job purely about building up a string or writing to a text writer. And then I basically said the last one was, should iConsole log formatter pass a text writer instead of returning a string? This allows implementation to optimize buffer management. That seems to be kind of like the gist of what we said.
Excellent. This is good enough.
We didn't go through any of the obsolete stuff, right? That would we need to next time? I mean, we don't have to right now. I'm just asking.
I mean, they seem fine. I would just make sure we only have one period at the end. But other than that, I think it's the only thing I would say is when you obsolete something, you kind of on the hook to point people towards what they should do instead. And we should probably find a way to precisely say that. And also short, because you only have a string that you put in the arrow list. But other than that, I think it makes sense. I mean, if we believe that these things are all dead effectively, one thing we could consider if the whole console logger options thing is going away, then obsolete the entire type. But if it's just the members, then yeah. But right now it seems like you obsoleted every single member.
It's line 43. That's the only thing it's required for.
Oh, I see. So there's one thing that is not obsoleted. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's unfortunate then.
The new thing that we added. We're adding one thing to it that's going to be obsolete.
Yeah, that's a good thing though. Like, should we maybe not do that and instead obsolete the entire type?
What was the question?
Like, instead of adding this property here, could we add it somewhere else, and so we can obsolete the entire type? Because it seems a bit bad to basically obsolete everything on a type and then add one more thing that's not obsolete.
I thought about it, but in order to make the I don't know how the deprecation situation works. Like, we need to support it for a while, right? So then, I don't think it's a good idea because there are overloads I'm adding that are using console logger options. If you scroll all the way up, if you remember, so I'm just going along adding more overloads there. So it's using console logger options. So that's, I think, kind of why console logger options. Remember the string thing that I'm going to remove? Right. Line 14. So now we're going to end up using line 13. Okay, I see what you mean. So instead of using line 13, add another one, call it... That's a question for David.
But I think in terms of our layering, right, like it can't be on the factory. It has to be on the provider, and it can't be on the formatter. There is no other place to put what formatter you pick.
Because
it is a provider specific detail.
I don't think we can change it.
Yeah, it's just,
it's unfortunate, but we have to keep it.
I mean, to me, like, think of obsolation more as a user experience thing, where you basically say, don't use this API, use another API over here. And so the question is, how do you concisely explain to your customers what the expectations are, right? And it seems a bit of a cognitive dissonance to say everything on the type we currently have is deprecated, but we add one more thing that's not deprecated, right? That seems just weird. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it makes it harder to explain what the expectations are. If you just say console logger options is dead because we exported this into individual formatters and you should configure them individually, then that makes sense. But that gets a bit more mudded up by the fact that you say, except for the formatter name that you don't have to pass in.
Which is kind of replacing line above it. Yeah.
Is it important to obsolete those? I mean, what happened if we didn't obsolete it? I mean, like, just leave it.
We're moving away from setting up the logger, console logger, the old way.
I think to answer Tarek's question though, then each of the formatters would also have to read the console logger options and then like compose this hierarchy of configuration. I don't know, that's complexity that is wanted.
Okay, makes sense.
Like they'll just become two places to set up everything, right?
I was just thinking about like some people may prefer the old way to do stuff, and some people maybe prefer the new way to do stuff. So both can be like reasonable, but if we need to force people not using the old way and always use the new way, so yeah, I agree with the obsolescence.
So I mean, is it not possible for us to say default console logger options, basically just instead of having a new type, you just extend the old type effectively? Because it seems there's some duplication going on, right?
Right.
Oh, so you're talking about line 62, default console logger option?
Yeah, basically saying like, I think the expectation is console logger formatter options, right? Everybody who does a console logger will extend this type, whether it's an interface or an abstract base type. I'm saying, why don't you just make that thing the same as console logger options?
Yeah, so if we were going to go with the base type, that it will look something like that. You're right. So
because we have
then the problem is the formatter. We don't want it to be on the base class. Does that make sense?
You could use the default console log formatter as the base type.
Systemd, in fact. If systemd console log formatter options.
Yeah, I guess we are talking past each other. Like what I'm saying is, in this new world, right, you have basically an console logger formatter options, right? And we said, okay, instead of an interface, use an abstract base type. And I'm basically asking is, could this abstract base type be console logger options? Because it seems like you already have a decent amount of overlap between them. Maybe you still have to obsolete some members here because they don't make sense, but it wouldn't be all of them.
So no, you can't, because one, the console logger options has the formatter. The formatter is something you don't want on each of the formatter options. And two, all the overlap that you see is actually being obsoleted.
Yeah.
So the only thing we could do instead is pick one of the formatter, like say the default console log formatter, and use that as the base type, or create a new base type that has everything that the default console log formatter has today.
Right. So then I guess we will just have to live with the fact that we have a type that is no longer relevant, basically, except for one thing, which is the formatter.
Yeah.
All right, then, I guess, let me just paste the notes in, and then we just call it a day, I guess.
Sure. Sounds good.
Thank you.
Oh, I guess I have to put it here, right? Alright, then I just bounce it back to API needs work, and then just let me know when you are ready for another iteration on this.
Okay.
Sounds good?
Sure.
Perfect. Then see you guys, I guess, part of you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye-bye.